My name is Adam Ryan, and I'm one of the curators here at CPW. Thanks for coming out tonight for the latest in our Meet the Artist lecture series, a program made possible by the Arnold and Augusta Newman Foundation, as well as the National Endowment for the Arts. Tonight, I have the pleasure of introducing photographer Chris Brooks. I first met Chris in June 2019 as he was passing through Brooklyn. I remember we met at a little Venezuelan spot in Bed-Stuy for tequeños. And then we walked back to my apartment to look at photo books. At the time, Chris was still based in the UK, and we initially connected through a mutual friend, the great British photographer John Spinks. Chris had just released his first book, the Brooks Press of Wirksworth, a project you'll be hearing about more tonight. And since then, he has relocated to the US and is spending quite a lot of time in Kingston these days. And it's funny how small the photo world can seem sometimes. And for some more background on Chris, Brooks is a British-born photographer whose work examines the complicated nature of belonging and family, nationhood, identity, and the power of place. In his work, he utilizes a combination of deadpan, humor, and storm in a teacup tragedy to produce an often quiet and observational set of images, a mode that he inherited from growing up in poor working class areas of Thatcher's Britain. After being seduced by editorial photography in the early 2000s in London, Brooks began to work on commissions for magazines such as Vogue and Harper's Bazaar, as well as clients including Chanel, Michael Kors, and Louis Vuitton, becoming known for his adoption of environment in still life photography, as well as his humorous way of combining luxury objects with everyday scenarios. Chris today will be talking to us mostly about the story of his first monographic art book that I already mentioned, the Brooks Press of Wirksworth, a decade-long investigation into a family business he knew little about due to the premature death of his father. So please join me in welcoming Chris Brooks.
Great. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming.
I'll help you out here.
Thank you very much. All right. Well, thank you, Adam. It was amazing that I forgot all about that Venezuelan spot, but that was fun. So Adam and I connected over books, and here we are. So yeah, as Adam said, he gave you a bit of an intro on what I do. So we'll start here. Ongoing search for home. So tonight, I'm going to mostly talk about a book that I made, which kind of solidified my interest in photography, in particular with this ongoing idea of home. I'll be showing this project, and I'll be talking to you about how it came to fruition, and also how that became part one of an ongoing examination, which happens now over 3 books. The second one coming later in this summer. But I'll be showing you this first one today, which is the book which is here as well. So feel free to have a look. But to kind of tee us up into that, I'm going to start with a bit of inspiration, some personal history. Mostly because for sure that informs how I've always made pictures and why. The language I use in photography is one that I feel is understood, particularly in this country. But I feel it's interesting to look at how I arrived there from a working class town in the middle of England. It's also worth noting as well here that I, like Adam just said actually, so I make work also in photography for magazines and for clients. And although I won't be talking about that side of things, this first section that we'll go through, that informs how I arrived at that approach, and how and the connectedness between this work and then the work that I also make, all my output as a photographer. And so we begin with the past. or which is the current mission statement. So it's a good place to start. So I was going to call this elevating the ordinary, but this seems to make way more sense for me. This statement is from, I guess, early social media days, when your mate's mum, the pictures that she takes of her cat are suddenly, so you see them alongside these pictures and potentially judged more successful than the images that we spend a lot of time working on. So, and in a way, I found this comment was pretty funny, but for the most part, it gave me a real tangible way to explain the language of photography that I like to make. And so I guess in a way, if my mate's mum finds the picture boring, then I guess I'm on track. So it is sort of a mission statement for me. So we'll start with some inspiration. So this book, you may know, this is my first photo book. This is Sign of the Times by Martin Parr. Rest in peace, Martin Parr. Still to this day, I think this is one of my favorite books of his. And I really loved this book when I first saw it because it kind of looked like my life in working class Derbyshire, Derbyshire being an area around the center of England. We grew up in a red brick box on an estate in a supernormal town on an ugly edge of an area of national beauty. We didn't have any money, but my mother was a snob and we liked to keep a nice house. And so this book spoke to me, gave me something I could recognize outside of my own life. Also growing up in working class suburban England, a lot of people's houses that I knew kind of looked like this. So this became a bit of an inspiration for me. Also, this is John Myers. This is a picture of his elevator at his local supermarket. John Myers is a particular inspiration for me, and mostly because I remember seeing an interview with him a long time ago, and he described really well to me that you just need to photograph the things around you because that's the things you have, right? So, and I feel like sometimes in photography, there's an urge to do kind of spectacular things, particularly at the start of your career. But for me, this information was way more practical and interesting. It's just to photograph the things around you. And so we did. So this is from his series, Boring Photographs, which is definitely something my mate's mum would find boring. So that's good. There's a debate here that we could have about what is deadpan and what is boring. But to me, we sort of see the everyday in American photography in particular. So we look at people like Eggleston or Shaw. But growing up, that stuff was still in England. That stuff was still super exotic for me, So growing up in the suburbs in a normal town, there wasn't a lot of spectacular things happening for us. And so you just soaked up what you could get, really. So this one's a bit less boring. What resonated with me, for me with this was that we knew our lives were pretty boring, right? You could see that every time you turn on the TV because we were TV generation as well, right? So for me, it seemed like it was almost like a bit punk to point out all of these normal things around us, to work with that. Like, David Bowie did this, right? So before he sang about space, like he sang about, somebody who was poor stealing from a supermarket. So, this was our lives, right? This was something that this was our palette, as it were. And there's a lot of humor in this image for me, which is also something I'm really drawn to. Perhaps there's some comfort there too. And there's certainly some nostalgia, which I do sort of dip in and out of. But for the most part, I feel like nostalgia in the wrong quantities could be dangerous. But I feel like, it's something we can play with. And there's certainly nostalgia here. So more John Myers stuff. This is from a series he did about TVs. None of them turned on, by the way, which is amazing. And some more of the same. So this is from his series, Electricity Substation. So for me, the inspiration comes in the light. So we sort of understand this approach, like post-new topographics. There's this idea, if you think about what the Beckers were doing, where the flat light becomes this great way to kind of make a comparison between things. But growing up in the part of England that I did, it's flat and gray all the time, right? For most of the time. And so you have to work with that. So this feels like the right way to describe our lives. Moving on to some color. This is Paul Graham's A1 series. I first saw this work at college. So this work was really interesting to me. It's about England has this road called the A1, right? We have these A roads, and it's called the Great North Road. So it's the road which kind of runs from the south to the north. This road ran past our house when we were kids, and it took you to exciting places like London, but in itself was old and outdated. And so they were building a better, faster road, which is actually what this project is about. And for me, what was interesting, I guess, was that the A1 was like the English version of Route 1, right? Which is heavily romanticized. But what I find funny is that this major road, like our Great North Road, was kind of just like a shitty version of another road somewhere else in the world. And so you start to get a sense of Britishness, of working classness, informing the way that I'm looking at things here. So this is from that same project. And there's some portrait stuff. So I occasionally work with people. For the most part, I prefer kind of working with objects and with spaces, but it's hard to be seduced by, it's easy to be seduced by a good portrait, you know what I mean? So it's like seeing this kind of work got me excited about making portraits. At times that's kind of come up for me. And also working on a view camera. A lot of this work was made on a view camera. And particularly because of this kind of, you know, this extra descriptiveness that format allows us, particularly when we're working with subtleties. But for me personally, also the camera slowed me down to this process. So a view camera, for those who don't know, is you're on a tripod, you're probably under a hood, and you're making sort of small amounts of film, like small sheets of film. So for me, it was interesting to learn about making a picture as opposed to taking a picture, which I realize works well for my brain because I tend to overthink everything. So, and then last one for the inspiration now. This is from Keith Arnott. So Keith Arnott, if you don't know, is really worth looking at. It's really fantastic. So this is a series which is like forever in my mind. Is Keith Arnott did this series about cardboard boxes, and so for me, it's such a beautiful elevation of something really simple. And these last ones for this. So these are really magical pictures that he made on a rubbish tip, which I don't know what that is in American, so I'm sorry, but it was like a rubbish dump essentially. So he would go make these really beautiful painterly pictures. And in particular, this really resonates with me because of the color. And also it informed later for me, like different ways of working. So for example, I always kind of lean in on looking at the point where the lowbrow and the highbrow ideas intersect. And so with these pictures, with this inspiration, I think you get an idea about like where I'm coming from. And so I kind of want to move on to, there's two key concepts that I always sort of work with in my work. For the first one is humor. So this kind of sense of the absurdity of everyday finds its way into the work, and that becomes important for me. I think mostly because life for us when we were kids, it wasn't easy. We were very poor and work was hard. So this statement in particular was thrown out a lot. This became a bit of a kind of a working class mantra in a way. Because in the background you have Thatcher selling off all the industry. My old man, he was on a picket line most of the time. And he was spent most of his time on strike outside of work instead of being in the work. And so, yeah, this became a mantra that was around for all of the people that we kind of knew. And then there's also tragedy. So everything I do in my personal work, I would say at this point has been shaped by tragedy for me for the most part. So I feel photography for me was a way to express myself from within a childhood where there was always bigger problems than there was my own. So as well as spending a lot of time on strike at work, my father was also dying of cancer for most of my childhood, and he passed when I was just 15, which is coincidentally is when I actually started making photographs. And this picture is actually of my father's wedding ring after he died. And so my father died, and then that wasn't it for the tragedy for me. 2 years later, my first girlfriend died. And just after this, my mother vanished without a trace. So all those things combined created this kind of sense of wanting to leave, wanting to run away. And so fleeing to the north, I left and started a photography degree with no intention of coming back, because at the time, becoming someone else, somewhere else, just seemed like the best thing I could do. So I was on the run, I suppose. And that was great because it did allow me to find an adoptive family, a community of other people, like other weirdos and damaged humans, particularly when I first started studying photography, and also after this moment when I ended up in London working as a photo assistant. So I'm working in London. I arrived there in around 2000, and this was a great time. There was plenty of work, and there was plenty of distraction, lots of things to keep you amused, which worked for a good long while until it didn't. And so we move on to part 2, an finished business, also known as if I could just afford the therapy. So I think we realized that this becomes therapy for me this whole way through. So we go back even further now. So this is my then closed family business of 3 generations, which is the Brooks Press. My family business was a small press, which if you don't know is basically a printers and a publishers working on a small scale. Launched in 1898 by my great-grandfather and then closed by my father before I was born. It was always sold as the first private press in the UK, although I later realized that this was my grandfather was telling a lie to try and sell more books. And so these 2 books came into my life, Reality of Self, Ideas and Ideals, which is like a combination of like kind of self-help books, which is kind of interesting as well when we go back to that therapy thought. So my father was a typesetter in the family business. He didn't talk to me much about work because essentially he inherited a printing press when people didn't need a local printer anymore. So the press was closed before I was born, and he ended up working in newspapers in the 80s, hence why he spent a lot of time on strike. He was working for the Mirror Group, which is famous for being owned by Ghislaine Maxwell's father. So his work didn't give him any joy, I know that for sure. And so the Brooks Press is something we never really spoke about. But then suddenly these 2 beautiful books arrived for me. And although I know the printing was tough for him, at the same time, I was really wondering how something so beautiful could come from a history that's so painful. And so this gives you a little introduction to the books. I don't have any books with me, unfortunately, but these books are really beautiful. So all handcrafted, made to arts and crafts principles, the pages left uncut and untrimmed. And so these really piqued my interest in some of these things because it wasn't like this history felt good until this moment, and it was like there was something that was worth exploring in that. So with that, I went on a bit of a journey with the idea that I was going to use these beautiful books as a vehicle to kind of go back and understand my family, but really all the time knowing that it was about going back and confronting some ghosts for me. And so looking in one of the books, I managed to find an address printed in one of these books. These are 100-year-old books at this point, by the way. So you'll see it on there. It's number 27 North End. And so I just filled the car with equipment and then drove to this address. So this is Wirksworth. So this is where I ended up. So this Wirksworth was an old lead mining town, later a quarry town, that sat right in the center of the Industrial Revolution in England. This image is one, this is not from the project, but it was one that I took to do with the project. I was really fascinated with this. This is actually the first book that my great-grandfather made in 1898. And I was really fascinated by this silver print that they tipped in the front. And so this gives you a kind of an introduction to that place for me, because this book was about that place. So they made this book about the town they lived in. And so for some context, this is where my father grew up. and so where my family on my father's side came from. And that's exactly 6.4 miles away from where I grew up. And so I arrived there in the dark. And this is the first picture I take. So imagine I've not been to this town for a number of years, like a long time, like as a kid, the last time I was there. And then so I arrive just on North End, the edge of North End. I'm staying next to a cemetery, which is where my great-grandfather is buried, which I didn't know at that time. But this is the first thing I saw arriving. This is the only light I'd see at night. So this single spot of light in the darkness, it really resonated with me at the time. So straight away, I'm making pictures. So I make a couple of sheets of film of this. And then the next day, I wake up, and the idea is to go straight to the address from the book. So in my mind, I'm hoping this is going to be, definitely having dreams of this being an old derelict shop full of printing presses, paper with 40 years of dust on them. But then I arrive, and instead I find this small town beauty salon. No presses, no paper, no sign of my family whatsoever. So, this is 40 years, but you kind of expect there's going to be something left, but there was literally nothing. So it was certainly an anticlimax, but these things don't always work out the way you want them to. So I then decided to contact the owner of the building, this is Jean Buxton. So her family had bought the building off my family, and they cleared out the press on behalf of my family, which she was happy to tell me was a total nightmare for them because it was full of equipment and paper and like an inch thick of ink on the floor. And so she could remember all these things, but the thing she couldn't remember is where all the stuff went to. Like, where were the presses? Where were any of the stuff which I would have been interested in having a look at? So we realized the memory is kind of failing us here. I'm starting to kind of get into this project, but there's really sort of nothing happening as yet. But the good thing with Jean was she became my connection to the town. She really liked the idea of the project. And so she was my eyes and ears on the ground when I wasn't there. She also would become like kind of my base when I'd be in town, which provided some comfort for me. She would give me tea and let me sit in the garden where I could be stared at by her cat. And so for me, the comfort was really useful. Because the project is really confusing at this point, but also, and gone are the dusty piles of paper and their history to be replaced by cat portraits. And so I had no idea what this thing is supposed to look like. This is a really non-visual project at this point. And I'm also, in the background, I'm also fighting the urge to leave because none of this feels particularly good for me. So I decide that I need a strategy. I leave, I hang out with the cat, I leave, I decide I need to come up with a strategy. So I decide, as I'm a stranger in this town, what I should do is I should begin with circumnavigating the town, but photographing it from the outside looking in. And this led to me having to work for my feelings a little bit, which I think was a place that I needed to access anyway. And so it became about trying to find things which explain some of the frustration. So for me, looking around the town and photographing things that visually stood in the way and blocking my access to the town became kind of interesting. Also, these dead ends. So the town was an old mining town, right? It was a mining town and a quarry town. And so it was full of these little passageways. They're called jitties. And these pathways, they began to really sum up my mental state. It was like, this one is called the Monkey Puzzle Gardens because it's so easy to get lost. So it was perfect for exactly what I was thinking at the time. And so although the visits were tough and frustrating at first, photographing things like this to try and sort of deal with the frustration of not really having any kind of connection to the place, and also looking for humor was really useful for me. So, I mean, because for me, these kind of pathways that they're going over is actually quite funny. So the idea for me is you find that humor, the barrier comes down a bit, and then I start finding lots of things that help me get into making it work. Like funny messages from the world. that I would find. So again, there's the kind of this humor for Aladdin's cave that I'm finding. Like there's something which is kind of connecting me to the place, and my spirits are feeling a little bit lifted by just being there and kind of working through those things. And so things are getting slightly easier, and I feel like I'm potentially making some personal breakthroughs as well at this point. But as the weather got better, things start to lift a little bit, as they do. And this became a really important picture for me in the project. So this was my first summer in the town. The horse, this was on my last day before I was going to leave. And I decided to hike to the top of the quarry. And I see this horse like in the middle of this kind of random field, nothing else, just this single horse. It totally wasn't caring about me at all. Like it was just there with its head in the grass. And so I made a couple of sheets of film of this. And the horse didn't turn around at any point. You couldn't see its head. And my process for this book was I would go make pictures, and then I would travel the 3.5 hours back to London. I'd go to the lab, I'd process the film, and then we'd make working prints. So I would then kind of spread these prints out. And then when I would reflect on this work after the trip, so I had this moment in between where I could reflect, this image to me it was kind of like a unicorn because you couldn't see its horn, right? And so this was the lightness that I kind of needed to kind of keep going to access further into the project. But also this horse kind of because I became moderately obsessed by this horse, I have to say, it became a bit of a narrator for the story. And so I ended up photographing this horse a few times. And the horse actually appears 3 times in the book to kind of help propel the story along. So now I'm starting to find things that feel good. But the thing for me is I'm still not seeing anything about the press. There's no connection to the press and towards my family. So I put an advert in the local paper and I head back to London, but then very quickly turn around and come back because somebody emails me saying that they find this thing. So I don't know if you can read what that is, but so that's a printing block. That must have been like a 120-year-old printing block. And this blew my mind a bit because this is like a logo block they used to use, which is like the Brooks with the interlinking O's. And I'd seen this printed. And so as soon as I got this, so my first thought was I really want to see if this printed any of the things that I have. And, you know, bearing in mind, like at this point, this is also exciting because I know this thing is going to be booked. Like it has to be a book. Like it's about books. And so at this point, this thing kind of, it lights me up a little bit because I'm starting the dream of finding the press is gone, but at least I'm finding things that I can potentially use and things that, you know, I can use that outside of the photography. So the idea was to keep pushing these channels. So I spoke to a lot of people, local people, and after much like messing around in people's attics and befriending with antiques dealers, I started to build up a collection of the documents, example of type, like they changed, they would be into a certain font for a little while and then changed that. So I'm starting to build up a little bit of a history, a little bit archive of what they were making. Also more beautiful books as well. And they had this great way of making books. So on the left, you'll see there's a prospectus. So they would make a prospectus. And what you would do is it would say have 6 titles that they wanted to publish, to print and publish. And then the price. And you would send them the money. And if they made enough money to make it, they would then make it. So it was kind of like early crowdfunding. So the prospectuses were brilliant when I would find them. But half the time there was only like 1 or 2 of those actual titles got made. So, but what I found was it was missing a sense. You know, I was finding all these beautiful finished things, but it was missing a sense of my family's hand in there. And so what became interesting for the project is when I found this local archive, and this archive was full of old stuff, old scraps of paper to do with the press, and a lot of things like prints, like where they'd then marked up the print to redo the print. So it became about sort of seeing my great-grandfather's handwriting. It also became about kind of drilling down into the things that became important to me. One of those things would be mistakes. So on here, I don't know if you see this, but so this place is called Derbyshire, right? But somebody's managed to get an extra S in. And I know typesetting is not the easiest thing in the world, but So, but this becomes interesting, and then I move some of this through into the book, because the mistakes for me were interesting because, like, it created a sense that there was a human there, that was more real, and also in turn helped me with these feelings that I had in general about my family anyway. I was kind of an abandoned kid, I guess, and I didn't really get much chance to kind of act up when I was a kid. So there was a lot to unpack. And so I'm starting to see real progress with some of these things, and I'm starting to see some personality, at least for the first time. And so I kind of I start looking for I'm starting to find a lot of documents. I realize I need to look for some deeper connections between these things and, the town, the things that I'm making pictures of. So this is a good example. This is a page that I found, which was showing the local church, some stuff that my great-grandfather must have worked on. And the church to a small village like Wirksworth is really important. It's the hub of the community. And so I knew it was important to have an image of this in some way, shape, or form. I'd not got there yet. And so I wanted to try and draw connections between some of the things I found with some of the things I was going to make. So, for example, in this one, I studied the photo illustration. You can kind of see from the shadows, there's a time of day, there's a clock on there, so you kind of know what's going on. And there's also, it feels like summer, right? And from the level of the shadows, you can kind of work out what time of year it is. So I try and then go back and make pictures around the same sort of time. And this one became a kind of a fascinating one for me because I'd come up with this time and I wanted to shoot this. And at the same time in the summer, they were having this thing called a clipping ceremony, which is where the congregation of a church all hold hands around the church. And so I go to make this picture. This thing times almost perfectly. I think we were kind of, if you look at the clocks on these two things, we're like half an hour out, which is kind of freaking out my OCD. But it was like they were late starting, so it was one of those things. It was like it almost was perfect. But the ceremony that I could land this picture, but also with the ceremony, is a big establishing shot for the place. This is really interesting for me because the ceremony gives me an opportunity to make a picture which is not just describing a thing, it's also asking questions of the viewer as well, which became really important for me because wherever I could, I would try and leave a photograph where it was asking something of you. I think mostly because I wanted to match the confusion that I felt that was happening in my head, and I wanted to imbue a bit of that into the photography in the book. So, for example, photographing dead ends, looking at printed material, but concentrating on spelling errors. And I'm leaning into this idea of disrupting the reality ever so slightly. So I kind of lean in a bit harder on that. So this, on one of the trips, I just decided to make long exposures during the day. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm kind of making like 20-second exposures during the daytime. So I'm getting these kind of ghostly things. Also putting ghosts of myself in the pictures as well. And then also trying to establish those ideas as well with the things that I'm seeing in the environment. So, I worked on this project like almost 10 years. So I knew that I could go back, I could see something and I could go back the following season and get it. And there's certain things which kind of kept pulling me back, which gave a sense of some of the things I was feeling. So the fog being one. And I knew every autumn and winter I could use that fog. Also, this is like an industrial area. There's industrial past this area, and so there's a lot of canals. And at certain times, the year, the towpaths would look like the canal. So again, it's an image for me which is telling a story because it kind of adds into the confusion. And so at this point, these ideas are really starting to come through for me. But it's funny, like I'll go back and I'll have a look at these things as working prints, and these ideas are connecting at this point, but at the same time, there's definitely something missing, which is a human element. So I have this sense of a place, I can have these documents, I draw these connections, but this kind of lack of humanity it feels a bit unusual, so a bit too unusual for the things I'm doing. I'd shot cats, I'd shot goats, I'd shot a ton of pictures of the same horse. but which kind of almost made sense to me, because in a way I was kind of going back to a place where I grew up as a child. So I was kind of connected to those things. They were sort of a little bit less scary, I guess, photographing animals. And so I started focusing on shooting people. So this is one of the portraits that I chose for the book. This was a girl that I saw. She was playing this trumpet in the street because she was trying to raise money for charity. And it was kind of brilliant because she only knew one song. So she just played the same song over and over again. But it kind of didn't matter because it's for charity. And so I passed her like 4 or 5 times and see that she was just really bored. So I just chatted to her, made this picture. And for me, there was something in it because I made a lot of portraits for this book. But for me, I was looking for something in there which was kind of mirroring what was happening in the other photography and in the documents and everything else. And so for me, I was really drawn to her smile. Like, it feels really enigmatic. And then if you compare it with this lady, so this lady, this was on North End. This is near where the press was. And I came past as this lady was sweeping her front step, but she didn't have her teeth in. So I thought there was a nice kind of connection between these things. This lady too. So I saw her, she was picking berries at the side of the road when I came past. And so I stopped her, had a chat. We seem to remember we had the most awkward conversation of all time. But I think it kind of fed into the shot, which I liked. And aside from really hating the light, like I hate the light in this picture, but you see this thing, you've got to make this thing at the same time. There's no coming back for this lady. So, but there's a sense of her being in her own world, which really made sense for me. So it became really important. This is a guy I saw. This is a guy in the town. I had a really amazing conversation with this guy. And for me, this gentleman, he represented the miner or the quarryman character. And he kind of, for me, he helped establish the voice of the people of the town in the book. So they had this, in the town, they have this symbol. It's called the Toad Man. And he looks exactly like this guy. And he's kind of sewn into like church cushions, and he appears on like tourist stuff. So this guy made sense. And also, it was like I wanted to kind of establish that these people there, I was going up to people and I was saying to them that this was a project about the town, essentially, and about my family business, just because that's the easiest way to describe it. But ultimately, really, it was about something more abstract than that. And so this is the last portrait I'll show you. But this is my favorite, actually. So it's so brilliantly awkward. And so again, there's this kind of sense of unease, which is kind of running through a lot of the photography, I hope. And that for me, this character was amazing. This kind of flash of green hair under this baseball cap. Like, she worked in the fish and chip shop. And that they had put this expression was kind of hidden. And it was kind of this expression, and this person was the one that I guess I was looking to make when I was a youngster in those areas too. So for me, I recognize a lot of stuff. So in this boring environment, you kind of have to kind of keep that stuff hidden. And so then we end up back at the narrator. So this is that same horse. The horse I learned much later, actually. This horse is actually not around anymore, which is a bit of a shame. But the horse became, as I say, the narrator for the book. This is the second time we see the horse. And so for me, what was important about this image was that I'm getting to a point where I'm starting to recognize, and I'm starting to kind of reconcile some of these things that are happening to me in the present, in the past, but also making sort of some peace with this place. And so for me, this is, you realize that this is not a unicorn, this is just a horse, all right? So things are clearer now. But what kind of was nice for me too as well is that horse is looking at us. So there's an acknowledgement that we're there and that we're doing this thing, So so at this point, the project is nearing completion for me, and it really just needs to be something at this point. So, I mean, it's definitely, as I say, it was always the idea it was going to be a book. So I'm going to move from this bit into the next section just because, so there's more photography on top of this, but the whole thing about this book was I designed this as it was purely as a book experience. So, and I've shown this work and I've chatted about it, like this might be the second time, but every time it's difficult because this is something that was designed to kind of give you something every time you look at it. So this will be the last photograph I'll show you from that, but I invite you to all have a look at a copy of the book, and I will leave a copy at CPW so you can come back and see it, because the experience kind of makes sense. And then you get to see the humorous third and final act from our narrator, the horse, which is at the end of the book. So we move on now. I'm starting to pull everything together. I have a designer on board at this point. And so we start making something and then we decide we want to shop it around. But the thing with a book like this, and when you collect a lot of this ephemera and you're working with beautiful type and you're working with beautiful print, I have all these ideas suddenly about how I want to make this thing. And it's really hard for a publisher to commit to a book which is in the same vein that I wanted to make it. You know, making a book is generally making a photo book is generally a thing where you don't really get much profit out of it. But for me, it was important to get it right. I wanted to have letterpress, like I wanted to have an element of the ephemera, because I'd spent almost a decade on this thing. And so we end up in part 3 that I've got in my presenter's notes. It says, all the money's gone on paper, so no chance of therapy now. So we just make the thing. You know, it's like I have these printing blocks. I have all these documents. And for me, suddenly the idea of publishing like a really expensive, like quite multi-layered photo book seems like it makes sense because, I don't know, I'm probably that kind of sadist, I guess. But also I love storytelling. And so we kind of put all these stuff together. We put all our plates together. We build some stuff. And so I realized in the end that the best way to tell this story is to not publish this with somebody else, is to relaunch that family business that my father closed before I was born and after he had died, to make this book about itself, and then hopefully in the process making some peace. So that you'll see this one, we made this is actually a title page in the book. So we used blocks that we had, for example, this one, and then I would also create text blocks that kind of sit with this, and then we would pack that together in furniture and make the print. And so we would make plates, halftones. We found this really amazing, super high-tech printer in Germany who make this like incredible UV cure litho, which is like really like an amazing type of print. This was the best print that I could find in the world at the time. And then to offset that, we worked with a really low-tech but brilliant letterpress printer in London, which is this gentleman all the way over on the left, bottom right, who does a really incredible job, but requires a lot of Chinese buffet food and pints of ale to be able to work efficiently. But we didn't work efficiently because we make all this letterpress and then we send this to Germany. But like, you know, a mega factory in Germany, they print this thing in minutes, right? But it takes us like 2.5 weeks to print the thing. So Germany is on the phone like every day. So you've got to send this stuff or you're going to miss your binding window. So 2 whole weeks after they printed the 4-color, much to the annoyance of the German factory, they finally get it. And so there we start to put it together and we complete with, this is the first, there's 120 years basically after the completion of the first book by my great-grandfather, 40 years after my father shut the press, that we then decided to reopen to publish a book about itself. And so for me, that could have been it. That was just like, okay, this is it. We made this beautiful book. This is also a beautiful version that we made with this kind of 100-year-old starch cloth we found. So obviously got a bit obsessed by the process. But the idea was that this is it. It could never really, I don't need to use the press ever again. The statement is made. But the thing is, when you do these things, it's really easy to fall in love with some of these 100-year-old book cloths and get excited about using letterpress and those sorts of things. So for me, I'm a bit of an animal for process. So for me, it was kind of perfect. And so it sort of opened the floodgates a bit. And so now, to kind of end this, I'm now working on, and also I realized as well, because this book was supposed to come up with some answers for me. There was no answers there. So I needed to have another stab at it. So I'm now working on 2 more books of this long and tedious home saga. This one being the next one, which comes out in the summer. And that's it. All right. Is there any questions? This gentleman here. Hello. Yeah, I did actually. It was interesting because I knew nothing about him. Like, my father didn't really say anything. None of my family really sort of spoke to each other. And then everybody vanished or died, right? So there was nobody but was kind of there to answer these questions. So I didn't really know anything about him from any of the family. But what I found in one of those, in the archive that I was saying that I found, in there was all these like trade manuals that go back like hundreds of years. And what became interesting was, because at one point, you know, this is a project about family, but it's also really not. It's like a project kind of about not having family and trying to find a sense of context. And so people would say to me, oh, you should really go into ancestry.com and find all those things. And in the end, I decided to not go on any of those kind of traditional journeys. I was like, okay, well, what I find, I'm going to learn about him. And almost some of that stuff will be a picture of what I invent myself. But what I did find out was, through looking through trade manuals, that this actually, and why I realized that my great-grandfather would lie and say it was the first private press, is because he actually worked, you know, we had something called a census in the UK, which is where every year or every few years somebody would come around and they would write down who's in the house and what they did and whatever. They don't do this thing anymore. But basically, he was in a couple of these censuses, so I could kind of track what all the family were doing. And it was a really nice way to do it. And in the end, what I learned was that he was an apprentice at a very early age at a printing press, which was in the town. And then I would see the guy who ran the press was getting old. So he must have retired, and my great-grandfather must have just taken it on. But it's an interesting one, because I never really kind of figured out, because obviously there's no other to ask, like, what his impetus to do with it was. Because I think he took it over in 1897, but then in 1898 he brings out this really fantastical book that was obviously the one with I show you the silver picture, that's the silver print that's tipped in, was like an incredibly expensive book to do at the time, and it was like a reprint of something that had happened before. So I did learn what he did. I never really learned what his vision was. From reading some of the documents where he's writing stuff, I have a feeling it was ego. But I mean, it still was interesting to kind of go, all right, this is all I need to know about this, and then I try and imagine the rest. So, yeah. Okay, thank you. Anyone else at the front?
Did you meet anyone who knew people in your family?
Not so much, no. It's funny. The lady I showed you, the first portrait, Jean Buxton, so she would tell stories. She couldn't really remember anyone so much. She remembers my great-grandfather from when she was a little girl. And she would say to me, because they lived next door. And so she said she would see, as he went past, she would see this kind of cloud of cigar smoke or pipe tobacco smoke. And she could smell that in the air, and she knew that he was around. So there was a sense of them. But there wasn't really anybody who kind of knew them. I mean, my grandparents lived there. They were the last time I was there, so I went to visit them. So they lived all the way on the west of the town, which is actually, I start the book with a kind of an illustration that says to the west, because it seemed like the first place to kind of gravitate towards. But there was my grandparents lived there, and then they died and they were gone. And I did find a neighbor who kind of remembered them, who actually became kind of interesting because he used to work in the quarries. So it was kind of nice because I would then go see him. And it was weird to go to the place next door to where my grandparents were when I was a kid, but then see this other elderly couple. And he would then take me on journeys. We would because the quarry was closed. So we would break in, me and this 90-year-old guy. And then he would tell me stories about all this stuff. So there was a sense of them, but there was nothing concrete, So, yeah. Richard? Have you done this talk back in the town? No, I haven't actually. And it's interesting because when I did this book, there's a story to this, right? There's a big story to this. And I did a show in the town, and there wasn't really a talk, but we did a show, and I did a little kind of, piece of writing for the wall. But what I wanted to do is, and there's no text in the book, and the thing I realized was I wanted this journey to be a bit confusing. So the whole thing with the edit, this is why I say about that, the experience of the book was really interesting for me, is because the edit, the placement of everything, the lack of information in there was really important for me, because I kind of I want it to be a frustrating thing to look at. And the reason why it's got a plain cover is because it's not supposed to give you that much. You're supposed to kind of feel this frustration as you sort of work through the book. But in a sense, when I went back to the town, I did a show in the town. There was a moment where people were kind of coming to look at the work, and they were recognizing people in the pictures. And in a way it was strange for me, because the connection moved from just this story I was trying to tell about this history of things and the history of me and this context. And a lot of it is kind of made up. Suddenly some of the stuff would become defined. Like somebody would tell me that the horse had died, or the cat had died, or the old lady was called Maud, or whatever. And so in a way, the connection to the town was only when I was there. And then there's a small rural arts organization there who I kind of they do an arts thing there as well. I would stay in touch with them. And then anyone who wanted some information about the family or whatever, they were going to write a history book, they would then get in touch. But in a sense, no, the connection to that, me explaining all these things to the town was kind of, it was almost like a step too far for me. So, hi there. Well, no, it was really interesting because there's actually the family pictures wise. So my father died, my mother had everything, but then she kind of vanished without trace when I was in my late teens. And so anything that I could have accessed was then gone. There's also, my mother hated my father's family too. So like I said, we were very dysfunctional. Everybody hated each other. So even if there were family pictures, they were kind of not things that I would find. I remember finding a picture along the journey of my father when he was young. And I kind of befriended all these little antique dealers, and they would call me and they would say, hey, I think I've got pictures of your family. I found these glass negatives, or I found these, like all these black and white negatives kept coming up. So I'd get in the car with a light box, go there, and then we would look through them and realize they weren't my family. So again, there was like a sense of, you were like, I'm chasing these ghosts, these are other people. And in a way, because this is about my family, but it's also about the absence of family, I feel like it needed to be represented in the book. And I didn't have any pictures of them until a half sister of mine, which was from my father's first marriage, who we had lost connection. And I managed to kind of connect with her on this book. She really late in the project, after the book was kind of almost ready to go, she found this family album, it was a wedding album from my father's first marriage, so from her mother. And she said, you should use this because this is going to be interesting for you. And what I found was, it wasn't my, it was my father, but it was my grandparents, but it wasn't my history. It wasn't my, my mother, it wasn't my family. And so, but this album had this amazing kind of Like you had a page like a wedding album has, and it has glassine, which kind of goes over the cover as well to protect the photograph. And for some reason in a wedding album, they'd use this kind of spider web glassine. So it was kind of really interesting for me because I was like, this is the only family photographs I have. But what I'm going to choose to do is and there's a book, it's near the end of the book. I want to acknowledge the family. So what I do is I photograph the image of the family through the glassine. So you don't see what it is. So there's a sense, again, all these people don't exist to me for the most part. They're ghosts. And I want to play with that idea there. So yeah, there's photography, but not a lot of it. So. Anyone else? Hi.
I have a question that might be kind of sensitive. When it came to the presentation and the book,
Yeah.
are there things that people might consider to be like mistakes that you did intentionally? Like, for
Yeah.
example, the page numbers in the gutter.
Oh yeah.
Maybe for the card.
Okay, that's interesting.
Where it's like,
Yeah.
I expect you to have come from the printer in Germany saying that you really need to do that. Or the page separations, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Things like that. Or like,
yeah.
like what's it like? Like for some people, is it like some artists like make a mistake intentionally to like prove that they're human?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, actually. And because I was so interested in the mistakes, and I wish I had one of the original books to show you right now, is the things like the page numbers, they were kind of did this really unusual thing where they were right in the center near the gutter. Also the way, I've got like a number of false starts and false ends to the book as well, which is basically where we reproduced information from all of the books that we found. Like, for example, here ends, like the book ends 3 times. It says here ends, here ends. But what we do is my great grandfather, what he used to do was he would print something. And if it was wrong, he would just take a ruler and a pen and strike through it and then print next to it. So it became this thing about kind of leaning in onto all those weird things that we found in the print. So, and this became interesting particularly with those page numbers, is if you're making something, you're designing this thing, and then you're sending a PDF essentially to Germany, right? And then we got to make this stuff with like a cranky old guy with like a cranky old printer, making the letterpress, and we got to try and tee these things up. And it was really interesting because it's like one beat, like the difference between when you have a photo page with the number and then you have a letterpress page, it's like one beat out. Like and it's done in a really nice way. And things like that I didn't plan, but I really enjoyed. But yeah, some of the mistakes, there's one mistake that somebody pointed out to me, which is actually in the photography, which was one image, and it's of like one of these jitty ways. And this was the one that went from basically where my grandfather lived, the great grandfather lived at the top of this jitty, and at the bottom was the press. This is the one where this lady Jean is saying she can smell the pipe smoke. So I made a lot of pictures in this kind of weird little alleyway, and all the way through the seasons. But the one that was most interesting for me was one where this tree had sort of grown down over it, and it goes very dark in that area. So really what happened was you kind of have this, path, but it's stopped by this kind of dark, black, heavy kind of print blob in the middle of a tree. And somebody actually said to me, they were like, is that a mistake? Did you mean that? And because also these things are quite subjective, right? It's like that kind of heavy-handedness with the exposure on that neg to a lot of people is a mistake. But to me, the whole point was it's supposed to be heavy. It's supposed to feel dark. It's supposed to be a bit menacing. But so that was kind of the interesting thing. But the mistake thing, it was like, let's try and control all these mistakes as much as possible and then hope, because there's so many things that could have gone wrong, right? Like it could have been like making half of like a third of the book here and then sending it to different countries to be put together. But thankfully, the mistakes were all planned for the most part. So, hello.
The folios in the gutter were intentional, and I thought they were a cool design choice.
Ah, thank you so much. Very good. Yeah, I mean, all that stuff was really mirroring the stuff that was in the original books. And so we would use, all the typefaces are the same. They use like Casanova face for the most part. So we use that for the book, and anything we needed, we basically would we had a monotype caster. So we would just feed the text into a computer, and then it would cast the type for us. And it was a really nice process because all the type that we made for the book, we then just melted back again. So it's like the type is useful and then it's gone again. So there's an ephemeral nature in that, which I will be appreciated by the creative directors in the room. So, yeah. Anyone else? Okay, there we go. Thank you very much.